Steve has been a luminary for natural history in Boulder County. He's been involved with Boulder County Nature Association and Boulder County Audubon Society, having served many roles on both of those, including the Teen Naturalist Program. And we do find it so important. Pat is smiling at me so much. We do find it so important to bring new young people in, and that Teen Naturalist Program is very important to us. Also Boulder Rights of Nature. And he wanted me to keep the introduction short, so I'll do that and just say that we're very fortunate to have Steve with us. So Steve, you want to take it away?
Sure. I do. Hey, it's so good to see you all. Thanks for coming. I think many of you know that Smith Lake is my home away from home, where I've spent more than a year of my life camping out by myself over the last 40 years. Oh, I didn't want to be too loud. Over the last 40 years. And this needs to be raised a little. Okay. And so it means a lot that you're willing to hear my story. So we'll just start it. It's on automatic pilot. So I'll take questions at the end. So just please hold them till then. You ready? Okay, let's let her rip. Yeah, let's dim those lights all the way down, please. So the first time I visited Smith Lake State Wildlife Area in the Sandhills south of Rushville, I didn't think there was much to see there, and so I just moved on down the highway. It may have been the merry-go-round at swing set at the entrance that turned me off. But I returned anyway a month later, and I found this osprey spearing fish in an inlet, and then came across this lovely snapping turtle laying her eggs right by the road, and I decided I kind of liked the place. So I set my tent up on a hillside overlooking the lake and tucked into a ponderosa pine woodland that had been planted there many, many decades before, not knowing that I'd spend 350 nights of my life in this one spot. I fell in love with the glowing light and the sense of wildness when afternoon thunderstorms rumbled through. Shell leaf penstemons coated with raindrops, and spiderwort blossoms that covered the hillsides in late spring. I kept bumping into wildlife wherever I went, especially on the entrance road, and in the pines behind my tent, where I found a family of long-eared owls, one of only 2 or 3 ever seen in western Nebraska, and I learned to talk to them and hang out with them. And then there was Roxanne, my wild turkey, who trotted down to my campsite once, and for 2 years we went on walks every morning I was there, and she would collect me awake in the morning and actually sit on my lap occasionally. So I began to believe this place was enchanted, and then when this white-tailed deer came up to within 2 feet of me and just stared in my eyes one morning, I knew it was enchanted. I know what she was doing. She was warning me away from her fawn, but it was still quite cute. So the nights were really enchanting. It was typical to hear 7 or 8 calling owls all at once. It still is. Great horns, long-eareds, and eastern screech owls. So that was June, but when I went back in August, the light was just as scintillating and there was just as much wildlife. I loved checking out the wild licorice fruits in the morning when all sorts of critters sleep there. This is a metallic green sweat bee. And then the glowing wings of the dragonflies, including this saddlebags. But I really fell in love with the blooming grasses. This is big blue stem. Look at those yellow stamens and those magenta stigmas. It's a flower. And when I looked at the blooming switchgrass, I could almost feel the stigmas reaching out to capture passing grains of blowing pollen. And we expect summers to be dry in the Western Plains, but this is late August, and look how green it is, and the hills are covered with sunflowers. And then in October, the light is just effervescent. Here's a big blue stem seed head, early morning in October. And here's a bronze copper butterfly. I think I like the light in October the most. And then the monarch butterflies are hanging out on the Solidago goldenrods, ready to head to Michoacan. And then you get the sandhill cranes moving through. And as I stood there in October and listened to these cranes, I finally got the message. This is a very sacred place. And it's been sacred not just to all the creatures, but to human cultures for thousands of years. I didn't go to Smith Lake in the winter to camp. I was too timid until about 4 years ago. But the night I got there was just gorgeous. And you could hear the lake heaving and yawing as I showed up. And I heard 7 owls calling as I went to bed. And then I got up the next morning and I heard this cacophony at the south end of the lake. And I walked down there and there were 1,000 Canada geese. And look who was with them. The first trumpeter swan family I'd ever seen at Smith Lake. But my favorite time is 10 days from now when I go up to do my annual breeding bird survey at Smith Lake, always the second week in June. And I've done it now for 25 years. And part of it is an atlas type methodology where I just look for birds and indicate breeding behaviors I see. We use this for both the Colorado and Nebraska bird atlases. And it's very relaxing. You get to spend a lot of time just sitting and watching. But look at this, 124 potential nesting species at Smith Lake. It's a square mile. We did 1,700 10 square mile blocks for the Colorado Breeding Bird Atlas. Guess what was the highest number we got? 103. This is Nebraska, folks. It's right in the middle of everything. And this is some of the best preserved bird habitat in North America. If you look at changes over time, there have been very few. You'll notice eastern wood pewee. Some of these eastern species are moving in as the trees invade the sandhills. This is the biggest environmental threat, as you know, to all the Western Plains is this deciduous tree invasion. Eastern wood pewee is a decreaser, excuse me, it's disappeared. But you'll see down below, we've got trumpeter swan, Eurasian collar dove, Bell's vireo, some eastern species, some human adapted species, but these are really the only changes. So I also do point counts. This is what I do professionally. I'm doing 8 of these for the city this year, 8 of these studies. So you'll see there are 10 point count stations. I just count for 10 minutes. 3 are along the lakeshore, 3 are out in the dunes, and the rest are in the woods. And again, I've been doing this for 25 years. So this gives us an idea of the numbers of birds. So let's see what we can find here. Well, as you can see, it's a pretty flat line. I'm sorry to disappoint you folks. We don't see a lot of change, but we do see some peaks and valleys, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Here are the individuals. There's one huge peak in 2003, and that makes it look like there's been a decline, but it's non-significant. So what's going on here with the birds? Well, there are some species that are increasing. They include wood duck, turkey vulture, and great crested flycatcher and eastern species. And there are some decreasings, including both the yellow-headed blackbird and marsh wren, and the grasshopper sparrow and curlew. So this is something worth looking into. And so I think I figured it out. It took me a long time to sort of work this out. So here's the marsh wren, and you'll see a pretty solid decline here. Well, it turns out that starting in about 2013, Nebraska experienced 7 years of the wettest weather they've had this century in the last 2 centuries. And a lot of the cattails disappeared during that period of wet weather, and the marsh wrens declined. And the same thing happened with the yellow-headed blackbirds. I know this is all counterintuitive, so you just have to absorb it, and we can discuss it later. Half the yellow-headed blackbirds I was seeing were on a cattail island offshore near one of my point counts, and that was washed away by thunderstorms during these wet years. So what happened? Here you have what I call a strip cattail marsh. This was a considerable marsh before all that wet weather. And the thunderstorms, the wave action during thunderstorms just wipes out cattails. We've seen this at Boulder Reservoir as well. So in these years, the bird population actually declines when it's really wet. Now with the curlews and grasshopper sparrow, you have something entirely different. They've also declined. 3 throughout this study. And you'll notice the last 6 years, I've seen only one curlew from my point count stations, but I hear them on the adjacent ranch. Grasshopper sparrows are disappearing all over North America. They're not doing well with conversion to cropland, and they don't do well when you eliminate grazing. They don't like really dense prairies. So here's what I think is going on. On the left in the next slide, you're going to see the prairie at Smith Lake. See how lush it is with all the grass and sunflowers. On the right is the prairie at Hen Ranch. And Hen Ranch is where I'm seeing the curlews and grasshopper sparrows, not at Smith Lake. Smith Lake hasn't been grazed or burned now for 60 years. So when you remove cattle and you eliminate grazing, there's a cost to pay. Grassland birds are going to suffer. In fact, at Kanza Prairie, the most famous prairie preserve in North America, where they've done studies for decades, the most birds always occur on areas that have been both grazed and burned. If you eliminate the cattle, you eliminate the burning, the bird population goes down. And birds evolved with that. That's why they're there. So it's a cost you pay. The other thing is this tree invasion. These are mostly eastern red cedars. Now, burrowing owls and curlews will not nest if they see a tree within 100 yards of where they want to nest. They know what's going to happen. They're going to get eaten by a red-tailed hawk or a great horned owl. So we've seen a decline in grassland birds, probably because of that as well. Now, how about this peak in 2003? Guess what? Does 2003 ring a bell to anyone? It was the third year of the worst drought to hit the Western Plains in 70 years. Now, this is the last 5 years when my bird numbers were down at Smith Lake. This is what it looked like. That was one of the wettest periods. You'll see all the shorebirds are just hanging out in the road. And so I compared precipitation with number of birds, and you see it's a very powerful correlation. The drier it is, the more birds there are at Smith Lake. It can't be argued. It's right there. It took me a while to figure it out, but part of it is this cattail business I was telling you about. When you have wet weather, the cattails get washed away. And so you have these narrow strips of marsh, and you lose your marsh wrens and your yellow-headed blackbirds, which are two of your most abundant species. Meanwhile, in the interdunal valleys, as the aquifer comes up, and it might come up 2 or 3 feet, you get these gorgeous marshes, and these are multidimensional marshes. And if I'm a marsh wren, I want to nest here, not beside a big lake. But in a few years, it dries out, the marshes dry up, and then the birds return to the big lakes. So we have a cycle here that I'm sure has been going on for thousands of years, where these marsh birds are benefiting from both habitats. So what does this all tell us? First thing I'm going to say is we get so concerned about megatrends, global climate change, insect die-off, urbanization, that we sometimes ignore what's going on the ground right in front of us. And what we're seeing here is something that's very counterintuitive. But what we're really seeing is these birds depend on 2 things. They depend on the native habitat, and they depend on the high plains aquifer, giving them opportunities to move from place to place from year to year. And I think you'd all agree that we want to conserve the high plains aquifer, and we also want to conserve natural landscapes, which is what's happening in the Sandhills. So when it rains in the Sandhills, all the moisture, 99% of the moisture goes into the ground. It doesn't run off because it's sand. All that moisture goes down into the high plains aquifer. Since there's little irrigation, this is staying the same. Look at the Ogallala aquifer, the famous diminishing Ogallala aquifer, and you'll see that more than 50% of its water is under the Sandhills. And in the Sandhills, the water level has been in the aquifer doing what? Rising. It's risen a foot or 2 over the last 50 years, partially because it's been a little wetter, and also because there are some reservoirs that are built along 2 of the rivers that actually trap water. In Kansas, how much has it dropped? 200 feet? Is that what you've been reading? That's what I've seen. So this water gushes out where you have canyons like the Niobrara River Canyon. It gushes out of the aquifer and forms these beautiful spring branch canyons. This waterfall is only a quarter of a mile from where the springs are. And then you have these gorgeous eastern deciduous forests with lindens and aspens and ovenbirds all along the Niobrara River. These are all being created by the High Plains Aquifer and this water gushing out. And look what you get in winter. These rivers flow at a constant rate 12 months of the year. This is counterintuitive to us too. How can they do that? Because they're all spring fed. And this is where the trumpeter swans spend their winters. And the trumpeter swans are coming back in spades. They were thought to be extinct from 1900 to 1919. Now there are 65,000 of them in North America and 1,000 in the Sandhills. These Sandhills rivers all have river otters. There's a place I camp along the North Platte River right near a den. There's a river otter peering out of its den on the right here. And they cackle at me all night long. They even tell me where to move my tent to. They get very upset if I put my tent in the wrong place. Blackneck stilts are now common in the Sandhills. They were unheard of there 20 years ago. And white-faced ibis nest by the thousands in the Sandhills. Look how beautiful they are close up. And of course, elk are coming back all along these river basins. So, don't pay money to sit in your car to look at grouse. You can do it for free in the Sandhills. Valentine National Wildlife Refuge has free blinds, 3-person blinds, and you just register and you go and you'll have an intimate experience with the prairie chickens and grouse. Even piping plovers, which are federally threatened, are hanging on the Sandhills because they need sand to nest. And I think the bison habitat in the Sandhills is close to 1 million acres now, either on ranches or Nature Conservancy properties or federal wildlife areas. And the cattle, yeah, they're cattle, but the ranchers have now used cattle like bison, using the rotational grazing. And I think the amount of grass in the Sandhills has doubled in the last 50 years. So that's why I go there. To me, it's heaven on earth. And it's such a feeling to know there are places where things work. And this is a private landscape. It only has 3% public land and things are working. Now, it's not all great. We have pondweeds on Smith Lake now, much more than we had 40 years ago because of climate change, warming temperatures. And there's a new algae that comes from Eurasia that's really bad. And this is affecting fish populations. It also affects duck populations. And we also have the most invasive weed in all North America. Does everyone know what this weed is? Smooth brome, right? You've got it in your yard. So that's a problem. It's homogenizing the prairie, but it doesn't get much up past the lakeshore. But there's one more vital issue here, and this is much more important than these physical issues. I'd been camping out at Smith Lake for 20 years before I realized I was trespassing on someone else's sacred land. This is the Wounded Knee Massacre site, 45 miles northwest of Smith Lake. One of the most horrific, atrocious things ever done by the US government. And it turns out all this land in western Nebraska is owned by the Lakota Nation. And that was determined by the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, when the Lakota and Cheyenne were given exclusive hunting rights for all of the western Sandhills and Panhandle. Now, all of it is owned by European Americans. So finally, coming to this realization, I started to study the history. Many of you have read Mari Sandoz's great book, Cheyenne Autumn. The Cheyenne were driven out of the Dakotas and Nebraska during the 1860s and 70s and given a reservation in Oklahoma. And this book chronicles a heroic return of the Cheyenne people during the winter of 1877, when they marched back, deciding they were going to their homeland, and they spent the winter in a place called Little Lost Chokecherry Valley. And they avoided the federal troops for 5 months and lived their last winter of freedom on Earth. They were eventually captured in South Dakota. The story is as tragic or more with other tribes, especially the Pawnee people of central and eastern Nebraska. They built their earth lodges along these beautiful spring-fed rivers, the Loop, North Loop, Middle Loop, South Loop. And they lived in a pretty prosperous way until the westward expansion overwhelmed them. And they were all removed, all of them. to Oklahoma. Here's a beautiful historic village site along the South Loop River where I camped last October. It's a very peaceful looking place, but when I woke up in the morning and walked alone along the river, I felt what historian David Wishart described as that unspeakable sadness. And we all have it. If you're not feeling it, you need to get in touch with it, because we have done a terrible thing. And it's time we owned up to it and did something about it. Here's the Niobrara River Valley, one of the most beautiful places on earth, where the Ponca lived peacefully for 100,000 years. They were also removed from the landscape during the 1870s and also marched to what they called the country of death in Oklahoma. And here's Chief Standing Bear. I don't know if you know what he's famous for, but his son died in Oklahoma, and he said, I'm going to bury my son back in our homeland. So he and 30 followers marched back, and they were celebrated by Nebraska homesteaders who gave them food. Lawyers volunteered to help them. They went to court and established for the first time that American Indians were people and had the same rights as other people under the law. And they were permitted to go back to their homeland. They weren't given any land, but they went back there, and I think they had 20 acres. But over the years, the Ponca Nation has purchased 1,800 acres. Here's their new cultural center overlooking the Missouri and Niobrara rivers. They're doing well. And if you ever get a chance, and this is in August, go to the Ponca Powwow. It's one of the most joyous events I've ever been to. Here they are with the grand entry parade. There's free camping on site. You'll get to meet all sorts of wonderful people. Everyone is welcome. It's really a multi-ethnic celebration, and that's every year. So here's a sort of, I'm going to give you a look at how much land has been returned, and you'll see those two red areas in the northeast corner of Nebraska. That's it, essentially. That's the land that has been given back as reservation land, where the Santee Reservation is, the Winnebago Reservation. Most of these other, here's a list. If you look on this list, I'll just let you look at this, but you'll see that most of these are very small parcels, 60 acres here, 2,200 acres there. It's still less than 1/100th% of the land that all these people legally owned by treaty rights. So I'm going to tell you, this is, I was going to bring this video, but I didn't want this to be too long, but there's a great video. I encourage you all to see it. It's called Roger Welsh and the Pawnee Indians. And it's a 10-minute video from public television where Roger Welsh had his famous show. And I really recommend you watch it. This gives us an idea of what we can do. So Roger Welsh was a radio personality. He had a show called Postcards from Nebraska, you may have seen on public television. And Walt Echo Hawk and Deborah Echo Hawk were residents of Boulder. They worked for the Native American Rights Fund. And then they moved back to Oklahoma, where they've been activists and cultural leaders for the Pawnee Nation. And they knew Roger because he interviewed them a lot. And they got together and got to know each other very well. In 1998, Roger was appointed to be on the Nebraska Historical Commission Board, which was a great honor. But as he sat on that board, he found out that they had done nothing to repatriate remains of Indigenous people that were stored in museums. And there were thousands of skeletons alone stored in museums in Nebraska. And the Natural History Society refused to repatriate those. So Roger resigned and worked with the Pawnee and Ponca, and they marched and they lobbied, and they became the first state in North America, in the United States, to get a law repatriating all the remains that were being stored in museums and elsewhere. So it was sort of a triumph, but the only trouble was the Pawnee leaders went to Roger and said, well, where do we bury them? We don't own an acre of land in all of Nebraska. So Roger and Linda Welsh were having dinner one night on their 60-acre ranch overlooking the Middle Loop River. And they said, well, let's create a space where the Pawnee can bury their loved ancestors. And after a while, they talked about it. And then Linda said, Roger, why don't we give them the land? And they did. And it's changed the town of Dannebrog, Nebraska in the most positive way you can imagine. Roger said when the Pawnee leaders first came to the Middle Loop River on his property, many were wearing suits and ties, and they just waded out into the water and started pouring the water over their head and crying. Many said this is the first time they'd been to their homeland. The flag in Dannebrog, Nebraska now has the Pawnee symbol right next to the American symbol. And there's a parade every year honoring the Danish settlers of Dannebrog. And you know who's on the lead car. It's the Pawnee tribal leaders. During the 2017 eclipse, dozens of Pawnee camped on the land. It hadn't quite yet been transferred over. And it was one of the most joyous celebrations they've ever had. So what can we do? Well, you already know if you got some land, you can consider beginning to talk about giving it back to its rightful owners. We can also take places like Little Lost Chokecherry Valley and demand that they be returned to the people who own them. These are very sacred sites. We can compensate ranchers. We can do land trades. There's a lot going on in Nebraska right now. A lot of property is changing hands. And the thing we can all do is really get to know this magnificent landscape. Get to know it so it goes right to your heart. Take a roll through the blowout grass on an October morning, or gaze with a hand lens into the globe-like raindrops on a big blue stem stalk. Or watch in wonder as an American ruby-throat damselfly perches on a cordgrass flower, or gaze into the eyes of a burrowing owl. I think the Sandhills has saved my life. I probably would have had an okay life, but it's made my life so beautiful to spend all these nights alone in this amazing place. And at Smith Lake, it's pretty much the same as when I first saw it in 1984. The grasses still roll away to a distant horizon. Look at the quality of the grassland. It's still dominated by native species. Upland sandpipers still perch on the fence posts on the tallest hillsides. One of my favorite birds. You know, they come all the way up from Tierra del Fuego. American bitterns peer out from the marshes that are fed by the High Plains Aquifer. And yes, my long-eared owls are still there, and we still converse at night before I go to bed. I hoot, they wail back, and sometimes they fly up and look at me. And trumpeter swans have returned to nest at Smith Lake for the first time in 100 years. And it seems if I sit quietly by the shore, they come over just to show me their young. And the morning sunlights are still just as glowing and still just as full of promise. So finally, I just want to acknowledge the people who made this possible. The Smith family was a homesteading family, and they donated this land. It's about 600 acres, 70 years ago, or 80 years ago, to Nebraska Parks and Wildlife. And then these are several people who helped me with the book. And I thank them all. But there were hundreds of people who talked with me along the roadside. One great joy of traveling those back roads in the Sandhills is wherever you stop, someone will come up by and say, "Are you okay?" Which means, "What the hell are you doing out here?" And then you have a great conversation and you learn so much from them. Here's the new book. This is a much more personal account of my time at Smith Lake. It was stimulated by my mom's dying. I couldn't go camping for a couple of years, which is too hard. So I made myself go up there at the time of the full moon every 2 or 3 months. And so I wrote about that experience. So as Karen said, I'm not selling these books. I'm donating any money that comes in to People of the Sacred Land here in Boulder, a wonderful new organization that's working a lot on indigenous land repatriation, Friends of Sandhills Refuges in Valentine, and the Trumpeter Swan Society. So if you'd like to take a book, the cost is $20. All you have to do is fill out this form and tell me which organization you'd like to send your money to. If you want to give me cash or check, I'll make sure it gets there. And I just want to do this to help spread the word. And I want to spread the word about good things we can do in nature, because this is a success story. So thanks a lot.
Steve, thank you very much. That was wonderful. We can take some questions.
Oh, I should be visible.
Yeah, come back here.
Okay. Yeah, any questions?
And we can ask Sandra, do you have any on the Zoom?
We do not yet. Folks here on the Zoom, if you would like to ask a question.
Any specific questions you have about places or critters, I'm glad to answer them. I'm just perplexed. I go up to photograph the prairie chickens and sharp-tailed grouse about every 3 or 4 years, and I'm in a personal blind. I think, Claire, you may have joined us one year. Did you or not? I don't know. But anyway, I'm all by myself on the prairie, and I can hear the snipe winnowing and the owls hooting and the bitterns calling, and then all these grouse. And prairie chickens are right there, 5 or 6 feet away. If I go, bark, 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 they come running right up and stick their noses in the blind. And people are paying like $100 to go sit in a car and look at them in eastern Colorado. I don't understand it. I'm just confused. Help me out here. I checked the list of blinds at Valentine National Wildlife Refuge. They're only occupied a fourth of the days during the season, and they don't charge anything. And this is why I go to the Sandhills. I don't ever pay money to go camping. For crying out loud, we all have the right to sleep on the earth, right? Every state wildlife, almost every state wildlife area in Nebraska, you can just go and camp there. I always buy a yearly pass because it helps support them. But so if anyone has questions about accessibility, it's a very accessible place. So I could answer those or anything else. If you have questions about what I said about bird populations decreasing, increasing, I could answer those too. Yeah.
Use the mic, please.
Any observation about the sandhill cranes over that 40 years?
Well, sandhill cranes are increasing. They're doing pretty well. I think the estimate now is they're about 800,000. No, more than that. 700,000 lessers and almost 200,000 graders. You've noticed that here in Boulder. We hear them more and more often. But again, I don't go to Kearney. I recommend you go to Kearney once to see the cranes, but then come up and visit us at Llewellyn. We have a party at the most unlikely place, art gallery and cafe in Llewellyn, population 130. And we celebrate the sandhill cranes. And then we go stand on the old bridge and have a potluck supper and watch 10,000 cranes fly in the evening. So there are lots of places you can see them other than Kearney. I guess that's what I tell you. And the best time is about this 3rd and 4th week in March. And wear every piece of clothing you've ever bought. Yeah.
I'll speak up. You don't have to run away.
Please use the mic. Please use the mic. It really helps.
13, where it just got so wet and washed out the cattails and things.
Mhm.
It looked like the birds had been declining even since 2000.
No, if you no, they haven't. The R-square value on that graph was 0.0913. Any R-square value below 3 or 4 is non-significant. And what the computer is determining is that decline is being driven by that one point in 2003. If you take that point off the graph, it's absolutely flat. So I don't, yeah, you're right. It looks like they may be declining, but so is my hearing, I have to tell you. So I'm not sure. I need another 25 years.
We've got a question.
There are many bird studies across North America that do show point count studies that do show declines, but I think they tend to be more in farming country and in urbanizing areas where you have areas that are not changing. I mean, I've done 100 breeding bird surveys for various agencies and private companies over the years, and I haven't replicated that many of them. The one at Boulder Reservoir, we're doing our 15th year now. But I'm not seeing big declines in Boulder County either. And Dave Halleck is doing an update on the Indian pig's breeding bird count. And he's found a number of species that appear to be declining, but it's not that definite. And he's found quite a few who are increasing. And here's what I would say to you. Bird populations throughout North America, if you take them as a whole, seem to be declining. I mean, how many are killed by skyscrapers every year? 1 billion? Is that right? I think that's what I'm reading. How many are killed by cats every year? Close to 1 billion. And that's affecting the overall bird population. And so is all this center pivot irrigation, fracking, loss of native habitat. But I would encourage you to find, like we're doing with our ecosystem stewardship project, find some native habitat that isn't changing. That was why we started that project 20 years ago. So we can see, given the chance to be in a relatively natural environment, how are the birds doing? And it's really a struggle to see long-term change unless you do it for 30 or 40 years.
We've got a
yeah,
question
on the
here
right.
from the Zoom.
Microphone's coming to you.
We've got questions from the Zoom.
Ah,
They're not hearing me.
Sam, you have a Zoom question?
Yes, we do. Christina, would you like to unmic or unmute and ask your question? You had a question in the chat, Christina.
Unmute. There we go. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
I think so go ahead.
Yeah, we got you.
Hey, Steve. Hi,
Hi.
good evening. Listen, I was wondering what they're planning to do, or if there are any plans to do about those grasses that are invading Smith Lake. You know, we had the same thing happening down here at Arivaca Lake in Arizona, and the grasses are invading. And at this point now we have documented 278 different species in our lake.
Yeah.
In southern Arizona. I mean, it's the second highest bird population species in Pima County. It's amazing, but the grasses are invading.
Yeah.
And with those amounts of birds, pesticides are being discussed, and that really worries me.
So I want you to meet Christina Nielsen. She's author of Living on the Spine, A Woman's Life in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Great book. She spent more time in her cabin alone than Thoreau and Leopold and Abby spent combined. So Christina is also co-founder of the first North American Turkey Vulture Festival held each March in Arivaca. So thanks for checking in. Smooth brome is a real problem. It creates monocultures. I don't know. The reason ranchers like it is it grows so well, and it creates these dense stands. Those are not good for curlews and grasshopper sparrows. They need bare ground and they need diversity. And the studies we've done where you have a lot of smooth brome, you do have fewer birds. So those of you who are members of we're not the Egret Society yet. What used to be known as the Boulder Audubon Society. Yeah, I know. What was once known as the Boulder County Audubon Society, which may change its name or may not. But I think you know that we own Dodd Lake, and we decided to restore the prairie out there. And we just took 3 acres, and this was about 12 years ago. And at that time, we got convinced that, and that was 97% smooth brome on our prairie. And we were convinced by everyone we talked to, there's only one way to get rid of smooth brome. And it's called Roundup. So we used it. I'm not going to apologize or anything, because the people who were on the committee, that's the decision they made. The board voted unanimously to do it. It was enormously successful. If you go out to Dodd Reservoir now, it's 80% native prairie. We wouldn't do it now. I don't think any of us would support it with what we know about Roundup. But no one has found anything else that works. When I visited these celebrated Nature Conservancy grassland preserves in Illinois and Missouri, I went too early. I went in June. We think June's the time to go to the prairie. Some of these prairies were 90% smooth brome. This is the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy is using Roundup on many, many of their properties still. It's not Roundup anymore. It's something that's supposed to be less toxic to humans. But no one has figured out another approach. Now you can use rotational grazing. That will help. And you can seed native grasses. But I don't know the solution. I'm sorry. If anyone does, if anyone has found something that works. Has anyone? Smooth brome doesn't look bad too. That's the trouble. People see it and they don't see it as a weed. Oh, look at that pretty grass. Yeah. And some people say we should naturalize it. Quote, that means we just don't call it a weed anymore. But I don't, Christina, I don't see that the birds do well in these smooth brome dominant landscapes. So I don't know what you're going to do. Good luck. Yeah.
Please use the mic in the room.
So my question is very similar to this one. It was following up on the grassland area surrounding Smith Lake. Is there any, do you know of any look at managing it either through grazing or fire?
Oh yeah. Well, I know what's, I talked to the ranchers, I talked to the range manager. The quality of that prairie is so much better than when I first saw it 50 years ago. I mean, or 45 years ago, when I first drove the Sandhills, I often saw vast areas where there were almost bare dunes. And in those days, they weren't using rotational grazing. They just turned the cattle loose and kept them in one place all year. Bison roamed, and they would eat the grass way down, and there'd be a lot of bare ground, and then they'd move along. So you'd get a mosaic of habitats. So now, believe it or not, in the Western Sandhills, they've doubled their stocking rates for cattle, and the range is in much better shape than it was 40 years ago. And it's because of the savory grazing technique. And they got through this latest drought in pretty good shape. So that's one of the amazing things, is to see high quality prairie. And the other thing is there's so few roads in the Sandhills, and there's so few settlements that the weeds like smooth brome, yeah, they surround the settlements. But once you get away, you're in pretty good quality prairie. Now, there's some problems with it if it's grazed by cattle, because there's some bird species that don't do well in that when you're grazing by cattle. And cattle also attract cowbirds who parasitize songbird nests. But of course, cowbirds follow the bison as well. So I haven't studied that. But all I can tell you is one reason I keep going back is it's how many landscapes do we have that are getting better over time? And I can't give you data, but you can look it up online. There are studies that will tell you about that.
And is that being applied to that area? You had the picture of the fence. Is it?
Well, what I was showing you there is the area on the left of the fence is Smith Lake, where they haven't grazed and haven't burned. Now, some people look at that and say, oh, it's much better. Look at all those sunflowers and look at the grasses chest high. That's not good for the grassland birds. They need the bare ground. So it's frustrating to me because I love curlews and I do my point counts and I can hear the curlews, but I can't count them because they're outside my 100-meter circle. They're on the hen ranch where they're grazing, and that's where they're nesting. So what you want to do with any landscape is you want to mimic what was there before the Europeans showed up, right? That's what we want to do everywhere. And in the Sandhills, it turns out that rotational grazing to a great extent mimics what the bison were doing. But if you just graze it uniformly, no, that's really bad. Yeah.
Hi, Steve. I'm wondering, sort of one of three questions. One is, what motivates you to get out and do so many things? Like you're measuring the rainfall and you're counting the bats and helping all these other groups start.
Oh, yeah, because
and all that stuff. And
I don't have children. I don't have to support anyone. You know, Nancy and I both could support ourselves, and we decided not to have children. And Nancy worked at NCAR, so she was really good with computers. So that meant that I had a tech administrator in my house every moment. I've been going crazy these last 3 months. It looked like a hard drive failure last week, and I didn't have anyone to fix it. So basically, that was it. And we didn't need a lot of money. And yes, we inherited a little money, to be quite honest. So I didn't have to, I get paid pretty well as a consultant, but I only work, part-time at that. And the teaching obviously didn't pay very well. But I don't have a science degree, and I never imagined I would be an avian ecologist, if you want to call me that. But isn't it great that, when we just find things we love to do and it turns out we get to do them? So I think I was very blessed. I'm very lucky.
And sort of a side question, like canoeing on the upper Niobrara, is that a nice thing to do?
Oh, yeah. You should float the Niobrara River. Now, if you go on a weekend, it can be pretty crowded. It's a very popular thing to do. But if you go on a weekday, especially if you don't go in June, if you go later in the summer, Nancy was extremely, we were both physically handicapped. That's another thing we had in common, but her handicap was quite severe. But she and I floated 12 miles of the Niobrara together in inner tubes, and she had a great time. So the outfitters up there are friendly, and it doesn't cost a lot. But if you can get on the loop, then you'll be entirely by yourself on the Loop River, especially the middle loop. And it has about a 15-mile stretch near its headwaters where there are no roads. So if you're going to hire an outfitter, I would try that one first.
And complete tangent, anything about Gross Reservoir and flammulated owls? Is there any hope that some endangered species will throw up?
You mean Forsyth Canyon, where the water level is going to come up 120 feet?
Well, they're going to log the 200,000 trees and the data
yeah.
there.
I think the argument there you should be making is it's gross. That's what they're doing there. You're not going to find an endangered species. Flammulated owls aren't endangered, and that's a small portion of their nesting habitat in Boulder County. But I'm going to say something political. I know I shouldn't do this. You know why Gross Reservoir Dam is being raised, don't you? You know who's responsible. Who can tell me?
Brad?
No. Your city council.
It's terrible council.
The Boulder City Council. We had a meeting, the Open Space Department asked leaders from Audubon and BCNA to come to a meeting 13 years ago. And if someone wants to sue me, they can do it. And they were gleeful. They said, we just met with the Denver Water Board, and they want to raise the Gross Reservoir Dam 170 feet. And they told us if we would not oppose that, they would raise an additional 4 feet. So Boulder would have more storage for Boulder's Colorado River water. That is a direct quote of what we were told. And they said, then we can use the Colorado River water to release from Gross Reservoir to create a minimum stream flow in South Boulder Creek. Does this sound Orwellian, or is it like a scene from Chinatown? Tell me which. That's what they told us. And they said, we want you to support us. We said, we won't support you. We should be putting water back in the Colorado River, not storing it. That's the argument. And I was just astonished. I was sort of out of action here the last couple of years, but everyone was yelling at the county commissioners, stop this. They don't have any power over these water projects. The city of Boulder enabled this project. And I have a friend who is on city council, and I begged this person to bring it up at a city council meeting. And that person brought it up and was surrounded by 2 lawyers within 30 seconds and told, we can't discuss this at a public meeting. I'm telling you this because it seems like progressive environmentalists in Boulder seem to give a pass to the Boulder City Council because we think they're on our side. So if anyone has a counter argument, put it online or something, but I was at that meeting and that's what they told us.
Let me see if Sandra has any more Zoom questions.
Let's see. One of ours was answered as Steve talked about canoeing on the Niobrara. And we have an observation from Paula Hansley that her breeding bird survey done over 25 years near Breckenridge also does not show declines in species. So
they didn't.
Sort of
some people are seeing, I'm not pretending that we're not seeing declines in lots of areas, but all I'm saying is if you have a relatively natural area, I guess what I do when I walk into an area and I say, how does this look now? How did it look 30 years ago? If it looks the same, I think the bird populations are likely to be pretty much the same. The birds are resilient if we give them a chance. But You got anything else? Well, I think we've done it. Thank you all. Peace and light to everyone.